Hello and welcome to Way of the Shark Part 2 Redux, where the definition of a re-recording is being pushed to its absolute extreme. In this particular episode, you're going to hear 80% new material that wasn't included in the original recording. It is virtually a new episode, and therefore, The Way of the Shark is a lot longer than was originally intended. There's definitely going to be a part 3. That new material contains new research into the history of modern ground fighting. So there's a lot of interesting new stuff in there about the history of the Gracie family, about submission grappling, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's definitely made me think deeply about the arts that I love. And those reflections will be contained in a separate podcast that will be made available to Patreons only. So that's my background in submission grappling, working with submission grapplers, my experiences training amongst the world of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But for this, I think about the movie Jaws as usual, the re-recording of this particular series of podcasts and its forced metaphor with regards to sharks coming from the quote that Machado made about it. If you want to hear about that, listen to part 1. But when I think about Jaws, I think about the making of Jaws and all that went into it. And one of the things that comes very clear to anybody who starts looking into the history of Jaws is just how many people had to come together to make it the classic it is. And I don't just mean all the usual moving parts of a movie. I mean about the script, the actual DNA of the movie Jaws. So beyond Peter Benchley's novel, beyond even Steven Spielberg's directing, all the script writing processes. The film went through loads of different rewrites on the script. Lots of different people put their input into it, and particularly the heart of the movie, Quint's famous monologue about the sinking of the US into Indianapolis. That's a crucial area that a lot of different people were involved in. And that made me think about martial arts lineages, which the extra material on this particular episode discusses the lineage of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the lineage even of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. So when we look at things that have changed, things that we've discovered, and various myths about lineages in martial arts, which is a very common theme in the martial arts world. I mean, that will form a huge part of some of my writing in the Bullshitsu series of books. When I think about that lineage, I think about all the different people that come together to make a film that you don't hear about, all the unsung heroes. And the truth is, lineages are very rarely just these single lines. They're more of a tangled web, just like genealogy isn't really best represented by a family tree as such. It's better seen as a bit of a web, or maybe just different channels into a sea, if you like, all coming from different directions if we're going to keep pushing that shark metaphor. But yes, I think about that. So when I think about an amazing piece of art like Jaws that became the summer blockbuster, the origin of the summer blockbuster, seminal classic, and the people that are given the general credit for it, and rightfully so, but also the other unsung people involved that are very much a part of the makeup of that particular film. And then I also think about the various different martial arts and how all of them are the result of various different individuals coming together and various different martial arts disciplines working together. Anyway, here we go. Way of the Shark Part 2 Redux. Oh yeah, and don't forget to like, share, and comment.
Before the existence of written records, humans systematized combat. From prehistory and into the modern day, martial arts have been a part of the fabric of culture and civilization. Whether as a means of self-protection, or to wage war, or to compete, or to preserve a tradition, or to touch personal greatness, these codified methods push us to ask questions, to explore, to express, to test, and to tell stories. This is Jamie Club's podcast, the official podcast of Club Chimera Martial Art, where we take the path of the vagabond warrior to find knowledge and inspiration from people, events, and ideas. If you are interested in where to follow Jamie Club and Club Chimera products and services, please wait until the end of the show. In the meantime, if you think this product is worth the price of a cup of coffee, please click on Support the Show in this episode's show notes.
The mid-1990s and into the 2000s saw the biggest surge in interest in ground fighting and the celebration of the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu name. Horin Gracie had been the co-owner of the biggest full-contact virtual no-holds-barred martial arts tournament in modern history. His brother, the smallest fighter of the first tournament, had won 3 of these early events, and other brothers, such as the family champion Hickson, would go on to dominate a rival mixed martial arts promotion, Pride. Footage from the documentary Gracies in Action revealed how the family had previously defeated other martial artists. If the dominance of Gracie or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was not being proven in the media, then their assertions regarding ground fighting were. Then certain things happened. Eventually, Gracie family members got beaten in competition. Sakuraba Kazushi earned the nickname the Gracie Hunter or Gracie Killer as he notched up wins in MMA competition against 4 members of the Gracie family, including the UFC icon Royce Gracie. Sakuraba had come from a catch wrestling background, and this would be an important point. In UFC 5, Royce had fought a rematch with Ken Shamrock in the first super fight, a match separate to the tournament. Despite overtime being called, the fight had resulted in a draw, as under UFC rules of the time, neither man had submitted or been knocked out or had the match stopped by the referee or their corner. Nevertheless, the way Shamrock had controlled Royce from the top within the latter's infamous guard and the damage he inflicted had prompted early skepticism regarding the Gracies' supposed invincibility. MMA soon became a good place to head for freestyle wrestlers who were both experts in controlling the takedowns and also not be threatened by the submission grappler's guard. The expression sprawl and brawl and ground and pound came from the contributions made by the wrestlers. Gradually strikers returned to the fore, but this time with solid backgrounds in both wrestling and ground fighting. To this day, fighters with a solid base in wrestling, rather than submission grappling or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, have statistically won the most UFC bouts. Since the UFC's early days, the rules have changed several times to become the mainstream MMA we see today, and the Gracie family, in the form of the UFC's co-founder Horin Gracie, moved away from the competition. Within the huge family of successful grapplers, the Gracies would eventually split off, not only into competing clubs, but sometimes making dramatic shifts from the core ideals altogether. There were those who clung to Helio Gracie's MMA vision of self-defense, whereas there were others who pushed more into the worldwide development of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a sport. Today, your local white-collar worker is almost as likely to be rolling in BJJ as he is breaking boards in his local family-friendly Taekwondo dojang. Likewise, even Helio's lineage has taken a hit from those criticising them for online coaching programs and even rumours of blue belts who didn't need to spar to get their promotion. The storied history of the Gracies has also been brought under scrutiny over time. This can be traced right back to the origin. As we discussed in the previous episode, Maeda Mitsuyo wasn't just a judoka in Brazil. He was a catch wrestler fighting bouts on the American circus when it was touring in Belém. According to the story, Gastão Gracie, a business partner in the show, was impressed by the demonstration given by Maeda and presented by the Italian-Argentine circus group, the Corello brothers. A year later, he introduced his eldest son, Carlos, to Maeda, when the latter gave a demonstration at the De Paz Theatre. So the legend goes, it was arranged for Carlos to train under Maeda in connection with a one Jacinto Ferro. Who was this Ferro? Well, it turns out that asking that question opens up a less previously discussed aspect of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu history. We discovered that Maeda was far from the first person to teach Jiu-Jitsu or Judo in Brazil. He might not have even been Carlos Gracie Sr.'s direct teacher. Once again, we find that the roots of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil come courtesy of my culture, that is, of circus, when Akshima Sadashi and his student Siotoski held challenge matches at the Coliseo Metálico Brasileiro Circus in Praça da Saudade, Manaus, in the state of Amazonas on the 18th of November 1906. They had docked in at Manaus on the ship Jerome as they made a tour of the Americas. This was 2 years after the then serving President of the USA, Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, had formally taken up Jiu-Jitsu under one of Kano's top instructors, Yamashita Yoshiaki and John J. O'Brien. After Akishima's successful demonstration over several months, the pair left for Liverpool, England on the ship known as the Anthony. There they would become a part of the growing number of Japanese martial arts teachers who worked in musical and circus and taught to a public already primed by E. Barton Wright's short-lived self-defense school and writings at the turn of the 20th century. Teaching jiu-jitsu to civilians did not initially take on in Brazil. The main way to make money from the art over there was to fight challenge matches. These weren't just catch wrestling style matches either. In 1909, Sensei Sada Miyako pitted his jiu-jitsu or judo against the capoeirista Sejako da Silva, known as Macaco or the Old Monkey, in a Vale Tudo match. Miyako lost the bout via knockout, and the event was reported in the press along with a cartoon depiction. It was a fight that became rooted in a lasting rivalry between capoeira and jiu-jitsu in Brazil. In da Silva's own words, reported in the magazine O Malo, quote, "I went up there, saluted the Japanese and began my jinga. I sized him up, faked a slap and applied a leg sweep that had him off balance, but he stood. The crowd yelled, 'Go for it, Sejako.' I resumed my jinga, leaning my body left and unleashed a rabo de areia, stingray tail, that made him eat dust. I saluted the audience, gazed towards the man holding the clock, but the gringo refused to continue." End quote. Several decades later, in 1953, an alleged observer of the fight, Agnor Moreira Sampaio, commonly known as Maestre Zinho, issued a challenge to Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Sampaio was an avid martial arts cross-trainer and realist, making him quite distinct from his fellow capoeira maestres. He had a background in boxing, savate and Greco-Roman wrestling before taking up capoeira. His early training in the art was in a virtually extinct form known as capoeira carioca that focused on street fighting, was largely associated with gangsters. It was matches fought under this style's title that had led to capoeira being technically illegal. Sampaio further added to the art by studying weapons and also judo. He moved away from the music and dancing that his most famous rival, Maestra Bimba, and others readily embraced. It's a story unto itself of yet another unsung pragmatist in martial arts history. Incidentally, the Vale Tudo challenge matches resulted in a controversial draw in the first bout and a victory to Carlson Gracie in the second. Sampaio's student was apparently fresh, and his Gracie student opponent battered when it was decided, upon Carlson Gracie's insistence, to call it a draw. Carlson won his fight, but by all accounts, it was a war, and the towel was thrown in by Sampaio's school. A year prior to the 1909 bout, Miyako and his apprentice Kekiada had been rescued as castaways on a Pacific island by the Brazilian ship Benjamin Constant. Whilst on board, the two martial artists had trained the sailors. They were subsequently hired to train officers at Fortaleza Vilgagion and then the Brazilian army. Miyakio's loss to da Silva, it was stated by Cageside columnist John S. Nash in his article The Martial Chronicles, Jiu-Jitsu Brings Mixed Martial Arts to Brazil in 2012, was a setback for Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil. Indeed, the relaxing of the law regarding capoeira, the celebration of da Silva's disciples, medical students no less, all pointed towards national pride polarizing Brazilians against the Japanese import and its foreign teacher. Up to this point, Miyakio and Kekiada, like Akishima and Suetos, had enjoyed seemingly superhuman success in their disposal of challengers, often in short time. However, the loss to da Silva became an embarrassment to the Navy, who expelled Miyakio from training their men. By 1912, the craze for the sport totally subsided. Miyako would eventually buy a newspaper in 1919, but it would all end in him being deported due to his anti-authority stances in journalism. A year after Jiu-Jitsu's apparent elimination, a mysterious figure, Mario Alexio, emerged in Rio de Janeiro. Little is known about this individual, other than that he began teaching Jiu-Jitsu at the Centro Desportivo. He apparently already had martial arts training in fencing, boxing, capoeira, which he combined with Jiu-Jitsu into a system he called Escola Defesa Pessoal, or School of Self-Defense. Like Barton Wright before him and his contemporary in France, Jean-Joseph Renard, Alexio was a Westerner who believed in eclectic combat training for effective self-protection. Actually, mixing and combining martial arts influences was not nearly as rare as historians and martial artists often believe, but that is a discussion for another episode. Anyway, the roots of any of Alexio's formal training is not properly recorded, and as Helson Gracie's fifth dan Brazilian jiu-jitsuker Josh Simon points out, the man's interviews are often contradictory. Alexio states he either fought with or trained with Miyako in 1904, but that was 4 years before the teacher had arrived in Brazil. It is possible he learned jiu-jitsu that way, but there is no way to verify this information. Simon suggests that Alexio did what a surprising number of martial artists have and continue to do. He learned his jiu-jitsu by reading books on the subject that had been translated into Portuguese and were on sale in Brazil as early as 1905, predating the arrival of any teachers. The equivalent today might be people studying lots of YouTube channels. The extremely prolific American journalist and author Irving Hancock counted 2 books on jiu-jitsu in his considerable body of work. One of these, the still in print The Complete Kano Jiu-Jitsu, Judo in brackets, was definitely in Brazil around the time of Alexio's martial arts education. The first recorded man to teach jiu-jitsu commercially to Brazilian civilians ran schools in the 1920s, where he taught fencing and jiu-jitsu at Club de Regatas Boquio de Passeio and jiu-jitsu and capoeira in Rio. Although demonstrations were very much par for the course to promote martial arts schools, it would appear that Alexio did not participate in challenge matches. Well, he did fight in at least one well-known challenge match, and that was against George Gracie in 1931, which was seen as the death knell of his career. Alexio was submitted via armlock by the younger George in round 2 of a scheduled 5-minute round competition. The press turned against him and he faded into obscurity. On Kano Jigoro's orders, Maeda Mitsuyo and Satake Soshiro had travelled from Japan to train under Tomita Tsujiro and help spread judo in Princetown, Columbia and West Point, as well as teach at the New York City dojo for around a year. After this, they would do what future Gracie nemesis and one-time Kodokan golden boy Kimura Masahiko would do, and turn to prize fighting and professional wrestling. From 1905 to 1914, the pair toured the USA, Europe, the Caribbean, Central America and South America, forming a troupe during their time in Peru, Chile and Argentina. Throughout 1914, they toured across Brazil. Then in 1915, they restored the dignity lost by Miyako 3 years beforehand, when Satake defeated Capoeirista P. de Bol in a match in Belém that harkened back to the previous Jiu-Jitsu versus Capoeira fight. This was the same year that Maeda began teaching at Teatro Moderno in Belém. He was the third man to teach jiu-jitsu in Brazil and the second, 3 years after Alexio, to teach to civilians. His advert was for both children and adults. Clearly following the model Kano had been endorsing, there was also encouragement for private schools to book his services. Around this point he must have been tracked down by Jacinto Ferro, who became a very apt pupil. It was either here or around March the following year when the school was officially opened at the Paysandu Sports Club. Despite setting up a profitable base in Belém, Maeda was always on the move with his troupe, and 1916 was no exception. Leaving Satake to settle in Manoa, he took the rest of his troupe on a tour of Europe. Docking first in Liverpool, they ran demonstrations and challenge matches across England and then into France, Spain and Portugal as the First World War raged on in the background. He then returned to Belém with his new bride, Deme Iris, and the troupe. During December of that year, it would appear that Maeda's first recorded interaction with Gastão Gracie wasn't as amicable as many of us have been led to believe. Gracie, a partner in the American circus, was also the manager of an Italian-Argentine wrestler called Alfredo Leconti, who was booked to face Unish Sadakazu, a member of Maeda's troupe in Manoa. It was agreed that the match would be won by a 30-second pin. However, at some point Gracie apparently reneged on the agreement that both participants wear gis. Leconti would not wear one, which seems ironic given the controversy linked to the Gracies and gi wearing during the early days of the UFC and the 1990s MMA scene. Using a trick that for me was somewhat reminiscent of a gag in the Hancock's half-hour radio comedy series episode, The Grappling Game, Leconti revealed his strategy for not wearing a gi. He had greased himself up from head to toe. According to Nash's article, reproduced on the Cage Side Seat website, Leconti then spent the majority of the bout slipping out of his opponent's grip and escaping through the ropes whenever he felt in danger. This did not appear to be the usual rope escape rule discussed by Lee Hasdall on our Kambudo discussion, but more of a cowardly flee to the outside. He did pin Sadakazu, but only for 3 seconds. This was enough for Gastão Gracie, who declared his man the winner and prompted a riot that resulted in wrestling being banned in Manoa. The rematch took place in Belém, but was something of a replay, resulting in another riot and another wrestling ban. 4 years later, the local newspaper, Estado de Pará, reported that Maeda had promoted 5 of his students to quote-unquote first rank. Among these students was Jacinto Ferro, and absent from the list was Carlos Gracies Sr. The grade is rather ambiguous, made even more so by the unsubstantiated claim that Maeda would later state in 1928 that he never awarded black belts to anyone in Brazil. First rank, which is mentioned without explanation, is open to interpretation. Did it mean first dan or shodan, or first Q, the rank below black belt? Or was it some sort of graduation or diploma separate from the Kodokan ranking? Regardless, according to articles that would follow this one, it would appear that Ferro was regarded to be in some position of seniority. He seems to have run Maeda's school when the troupe was touring. When Maeda returned from a tour in Cuba and in New York in 1922, Ferro was reported in the press greeting his master on a dinghy. A year previously, Maeda was collectively referred to as one of 3 professors in attendance at the jiu-jitsu school. Ferro was one of the other 2. The article also writes that the show would include a demonstration given by 2 of Ferro's students. Their names are recorded as Donato Pires Dolri and Oscar Gracie. Besides Gasto Gracie's connection to the wrestling events, this is the first extant article uncovered that connects the Gracie name to jiu-jitsu. It's certainly the first one that reports one being a jiu-jitsuka. The article contradicts the main Gracie narrative that Carlos Gracie Sr., the founder of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, the art that would popularise and largely populate Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Oscar is clearly an editorial error. Gasto Gracie never had a child called Oscar, and this was the only family in Brazil bearing the name Gracie. Some critics have gone as far as to say that Carlos Gracie didn't even meet Maeda. There is no way of proving this either way, but I think that it's a stretch. His father certainly would have known him through their dealings with the circus and the controversial matches with Leconte and Sadakazu. He was impressed enough to send his eldest son to train at Maeda's academy. However, it appeared that Maeda spent a lot of time away from the dojo fighting and performing with his troupe on tour. Ferro was the de facto head teacher employed by Maeda to run things in Brazil. It's sometimes stated in Gracie Press that Donato Pires, Carlos's partner in the 1921 demonstration, was a contemporary of Ferro. However, the article clearly states he was Ferro's student. Later articles reveal more. In another tangent to the main historical narrative, it would appear that Pires was senior to Carlos and might have also been his teacher. This assertion, according to Josh Simon's sources, has been made by the fact that Pires opened a jiu-jitsu academy in Rio, where he was described as the director, and would be later joined by 2 individuals who were listed as his assistant teachers, Carlos Gracie and one of his younger brothers, George. Pires and Carlos had taught previously at Rio in Minas Gerais in 1928, when Pires was awarded a 2-year contract to teach the state police. Pires claimed that he was certified by Maeda, and this fact, although never substantiated by actual certification or newspaper reports, has never been challenged. Pires and Carlos would part ways only 3 months after starting their school in Rio. The reason behind their parting of ways is unclear, but Pires' opening of another academy 9 years later might be a little telling. Regardless of what happened, by December that year, Carlos was declared head teacher of the school, and it was advertised as Academia Gracie in October 1932. I find it interesting that Josh Simon makes no mention of Oswaldo and Gasto Jr. in his article on Pires, who the Gracies list as assistant instructors along with George and Carlos. The dojo would be the second jiu-jitsu school after Alexio's to open in Rio. It soon became the only one after George's infamous challenge match with Alexio. Just about all sources indicate and agree that George, the youngest of the 4 brothers teaching at the school that was set up by Pires, became the golden boy who took up the majority of the Gracie challenges against rival martial arts schools. His relationship with Carlos was often strained. George was known as the wild man of the family, and he never fell in with Carlos's ideas regarding diet, and often opposed his elder brother's business decisions. The two was split in 1936, following Carlos forbidding a fight taking place between George and new rising Gracie golden boy Helio. A lot of money was on the line, but Carlos would not be a part of the arrangement. Matters had been rocky for a while. George had been hanging with luta livre fighters and regularly competing in cross-style competitions when Carlos wanted to better establish pure jiu-jitsu bouts. He had also been openly scathing of Carlos in the press in 1934, saying the head of the Gracie clan had neither the authority nor the competence to speak of jiu-jitsu, citing himself as the creator of his family's sporting tradition. When Donato Pires opened his new academy in Sao Paulo in 1939, his assistant instructor was none other than George Gracie. During the interim, Pires had continued with his other career as a tax collector. He also taught self-defense programs to law enforcement across various states, commented on fights, and served as a fight official. He met up with George Gracie in Sao Paulo when the two had been travelling around the country competing in a wide range of different fights. With Elio officially retiring from competing in 1938 aged 25, the same age as Carlos and as Waldo, he remained the sole fighting member of the Gracie family for a while until he met his future wife in Sao Paulo. George went into business with his brother's former teacher, and in the early 1950s he re-established contact with his brothers. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be a happy reunion, or at least the happiness of the reunion wasn't to last. George opened an academy under the Gracie name in Rio. Worse still, he was charging less than Elio, who is now the head of the family's official jiu-jitsu operations. This would be far from the last of the Gracie familial fallout, and a demonstration of how martial arts lineages are rarely straightforward. Establishing a clear line directly from Maeda to Carlos and then to Elio Gracie makes for neat martial arts copy. After all, Maeda and his troops' national and international success was assured thanks to the regularly publicised spectacles and his marrying of catch wrestling's popularity with jiu-jitsu's orientalist appeal. Maeda was, by most accounts, a very accomplished fighter who beat a wide range of different opponents, and so did his students. In 1925, he became actively involved in settling Japanese immigrants near Tomiyaku, a Japanese-owned company in Para, Brazil. He would continue to teach in Para, mainly to Japanese children, and it would appear he fully adopted the judo title now used by the Kodokan. The original dojo in Japan seems to have approved of his teaching operations, awarding Maeda a 6th dan in 1929 and later a 7th dan on the 27th of November 1941. Sadly, he would never know of his promotion due to his death from kidney disease one day later. He has gone down in history as a very respected martial artist, teacher, fighter and philanthropist in Brazil and his native Japan. As for Jacinto Ferro, he had been a competitive cyclist, boxer, Greco-Roman wrestler and weightlifter before he was one of the rare few to track down Maeda and become a direct student under him. After that, he became Maeda's club caretaker and secretary. He pretty much ran the school and taught students like Donato Pires and Carlos Gracie, but little is recorded of him until his death in 1929. Ferro seems to have done little to publicise himself. If it wasn't for the likes of Robert Drysdale and Josh Simon, he would be completely lost to obscurity. Ferro reminds me of that typical club secretary you find in a number of martial arts schools, who probably know more about their head teacher's martial arts than anyone else, but are mainly seen scurrying around organising matters only to be forgotten in the wake of their sensei's fame. As for Pires, we can only speculate the possible bad blood between him and Carlos. The latter took over his academy, and almost a decade later Pires turns up running a new academy with Carlos's estranged brother. Future Jamie here. As it turns out, these early years of the Gracie Academy and their relationship with Donato Pires has a darker side. After recording this dive into the lesser-known parts of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu history, I came across more information that seems to demonstrate just how gangster, if you like, the rise of the art was back in 1930s Rio. Let's go back over some of this history to see if some of the gaps can be filled and questions answered. According to Low Kick MMA's page of Carlos Gracie Sr., the original head of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu was forced to quit training at Maeda's dojo after 3 years. Jacinto Ferro is mentioned as Maeda's assistant. Gasto Gracie Sr.'s business in Berlin went bankrupt, forcing the family to move to Rio de Janeiro, where they opened up a casino, and Carlos worked as a bouncer. I find it quite interesting, actually, this particular fact coming from Low Kick Martial Arts, if it indeed is a fact, that the Gracies were running a casino in Rio de Janeiro, given that it was illegal at that point, and it wouldn't be legalized until the 1930s. So what does that tell us about the Gracie background? From what research I've seen online, any gambling would be done in a formal fashion, but this is the era of the just before the sort of the speakeasies and all that sort of thing happening over in the USA. But no, in Rio, it was illegal to run a casino as such. Marking the first chronological feud in the Gracie family, Gaston and Carlos fell out. The latter moved away from the family and found work doing small jobs. During this time, he reconnected with Pires, who he knew from Maida's school. Donato was teaching self-defense to the police at the time. Here, Carlos became immersed in training, and presumably it was a lot of one-to-one, or at least intensive training. According to Gracie law in 1925, Carlos rented Rua Marquez de Abrantes, where he began training Elio Gracie. It was a small house and they trained in the living room. Again, the story of Elio, being trained by his elder brother, supported by the dramatic promotional photos, make for a neat story that fits with the lineage when Elio took over the head of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. However, we know that Carlos first trained the three brothers older than Elio, Oswaldo, Gaston and George. The date of the Rua Marquez de Abrantes school officially opening is disputed. Josh Simon has it down as September 1930, referencing the promotional articles where Carlos is in partnership with Pires, who it now appears to be confirmed as his main teacher and probably more responsible for his training than Ferro. We still don't know why Pires left the academy in December of that year. However, Jiu-Jitsu Legacy's website references an incident that demonstrates that the blood was certainly very bad between them. In August the following year, Pires doesn't completely leave the scene, and we know he's in Rio because, according to Jiu-Jitsu Legacy's The Darker Side of the Gracie Family article, he was attacked by the Gracie brothers outside the America Hotel in the Katechi neighbourhood. Who was present is not clear. The reason for the assault was down to Pires publicly challenging Carlos Gracie's claim that he was a direct student of Maida. Whether there was police involvement and the extent of Pires' injuries is unclear, but it demonstrates disputes regarding the Maida-Carlos lineage going back far further than has been reported in more recent press. This type of behaviour would not be an isolated event for the Gracies, who took aggressive competition to another level. According to Josh Simon, on the 14th of January 1932, Carlos, Oswaldo, George and Elio assaulted João Baldi outside the Café Simpatia in Rio. The attack was stopped when Army Lieutenant Newton Medeiros saw what was happening and jumped off a bus to intercede. Apparently, George was arrested on the spot, whereas Carlos and Elio fled the scene. Witness reports regarding whether Oswaldo was also arrested at the time or ran with the other two brothers is unclear. Gaston Jr. wasn't present. However, what does appear to be present was an infamous metal box that Carlos reportedly used to bludgeon Baldi. More on this later. Despite the newspaper reports and police statements, the Gracies escaped being formally charged. How they got away with this incident is not explained, but we might get an idea with what would happen in a subsequent episode. Meanwhile, here's some background on the attack. Baldi had been targeted after his fight with Oswaldo on the 19th of November 1931. It was a match that footage would be used to demonstrate Gracie Jiu-Jitsu's effectiveness in securing victories for smaller fighters over much larger opponents. Oswaldo, although not a regular competitor, had just previously won a Vale Tudo match against a 190-pound opponent from Bahia in northeastern Brazil. Weighing just 141 pounds, Oswaldo's victory had looked impressive. Baldi was even heavier at 275 pounds, and some even said 300 pounds, although that seems like an exaggeration. He appears to have been a journeyman professional wrestler, competing under Greco-Roman and catch rules. However, he was now 51 years old, and that weight clearly wasn't all muscle. Back in his heyday, he was regularly listed at 220 pounds. At only 5'7", he made for an extremely stocky-looking adversary for the 27-year-old Oswaldo. Again, we find another example of gi controversy in this fight. The Gracies had demanded that both fighters wear gi tops, but Baldi had refused and demanded he wear his standard wrestling trunks and shoes only. Somehow he was convinced at the last moment and sealed his defeat when he walked to the ring wearing the jacket that Oswaldo would use to choke him out before the end of the first round. Interestingly, the bout was refereed by none other than the vanquished Gracie rival, Mario Alexio. The fight was filmed and is featured on the Gracies in Action documentaries, where Horian Gracie describes his uncle Oswaldo easily defeating the much larger John, not João, Baldi. Watching it for the first time in the late 80s onwards, future generations of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fans would see it as a fleeting chapter in the story of Gracie challenge matches where the sport was publicised on the way it could give diminutive people the ability to beat much larger opponents. What isn't discussed is the fallout of the bout leading up to the assault on Baldy. Again, details on the disagreement are not clear. There are, as of yet, unsubstantiated claims that Baldy was so embarrassed by his loss that he spread a rumour the fight was a work. Professional wrestling, with its predetermined endings, had been established at least 6 years before with the first worked World Professional Championship between Ed Strangler Lewis and Wayne Munn. Although the tradition of kayfabe would technically stay in place until the 1990s, a good number of people weren't fooled by the spectacle. There was certainly a problem within grappling circles where many groups were distancing themselves from sports entertainment and feared it would tarnish the legitimate reputation of their arts. Indeed, we've got various different episodes where different associations and groups fell out with their fighters when they took up the lucrative call of professional wrestling, which was becoming ever more popular once it had become a form of sports entertainment, a staged spectacle. The issues with Kimura, with the Kodokan, would happen in the 1940s, but the Gracies would have their own problems, and I believe it's even reported in official Gracie literature that there was fallings out between George Gracie and the family because George did professional wrestling matches as well as legitimate contests. We might put all that firmly under the banner of George Gracie just not towing the official Gracie party line. However, for Baldy to make this claim in his bout against Oswaldo just seems rather stupid and unlikely. The whole point of worked matches was to make professional catch wrestling bouts more entertaining for lay audiences with the introduction of more theatrical elements. This bout was none of that. Furthermore, as Simon argues, why bother with the gi? It might be quite fairly argued that the Gracies slanted matters in their favour, but a work, or even a straightforward fix, seems unlikely in this instance. Baldy claims the assault was prompted by an argument that occurred a day beforehand on the 13th of January. He said he hadn't been paid for the fight, and when he asked Carlos for the money at the Rio Boxing Club, Carlos refused and stormed off. The assault on Baldy seems like something of an overreaction on that single argument, although we might speculate if Baldy was telling the truth about it happening at all. A lot more was said than "pay me the money I'm owed." Were threats made? Was Baldy telling anyone who would listen that the fight was fixed? Was Baldy claiming that the money owed was extra for throwing the fight? So I've got a couple of Helio Gracie friendly points of view on this that I found on the internet. So I thought I'd produce them for the in the interests of balance and also to hear the take on it. I mean, obviously it's not in the Gracie way. It's not in a lot of the Gracie materials. I can't see a lot of mentioning of this particular incident beyond Baldy getting defeated in the footage that's shown in the Gracies in action. But anyway, Old School Jiu-Jitsu put up a post where they described Oswaldo Gracie as a younger brother of Helio. We know that that's not correct for a start. Helio was 9 years younger than Oswaldo, and Oswaldo was second only to Carlos in the ages of the brothers. They seem to think also that the Baldy match was the highlight of Oswaldo's career, and perhaps it was. Certainly the highlight of his Vale Tudo career. But they then have the hyperbole of Baldy weighing 297 pounds, which as we suspect it was an exaggeration, but Oswaldo was then put down to 136 pounds, and we know he was around 141. That's what he'd weighed in at in a previous match. But anyway, they have the match ending in 58 seconds. But the interesting piece of information here is that they describe Oswaldo occasionally participating in fixed professional wrestling matches. That's worked professional wrestling matches for money. So the hint there is the fact that you could have a more lucrative career at that time working in the worked professional wrestling matches. Work professional wrestling obviously was on a huge rise at that particular point, both in the US and the UK, and I should imagine also in other parts of the world too. But anyway, but it's interesting that Oswaldo would be involved in that as well, and might have something to do with the Gracies not really mentioning much about him beyond this point here, and also the issues that they had with George. But anyway, George is also lumbered with being the only person involved in the incident with Baldy after the fight. So they put it that basically someone, they don't name Baldy actually, they just say a doubter, was saying that the match was a fix. And therefore, George confronted the doubter, beat that person up in a street fight. So that it's a one-on-one competition, a straightener outside, if you like, and that George was arrested for it. So that's the full information they have there. So Baldy isn't even cited as the person involved in the incident afterwards. And he's in this case, he's also not portrayed as the person who was claiming the fight was a fix. But that's different in BJJ Heroes. So on that website, we have Osvaldo being set to fight a very large Greco-Roman wrestler who is named João Baldy. So yes, Greco-Roman wrestling was Baldy's base art, and that's also in the post as well. They have Baldy down as 297 pounds again. So again, what appears to be a bit of an exaggeration there. And that everybody thought he was going to squash Osvaldo. I mean, obviously, we know that this is all part of the very useful marketing angle on all this. How the small man beats the large man, and it's was used decades later as part of the Gracie publicity. However, no one in the stands had ever witnessed such a one-sided fight with a size difference that big, and immediately assumed the fight was a fix, according to this article. So the fighter Baldy didn't help clear the air when, maybe trying to save face, they have in brackets, he told the press that it was indeed a megalodon, a fix. So excuse my Portuguese there, and that he would have never lost otherwise. So when George read the interview in a newspaper, he was enraged, and being the hothead he was, he went out seeking for Baldy. So we've got George, again, usefully portrayed as the wild man of the group, the wild card of the Gracies. So when he found Baldy, he beat him up in a public square. But the beating was such that Baldy was hospitalized, and when he came out, he pressed charges against the Gracie, stating that he had been beaten with brass knuckles. The police investigated the case, but as witnesses ditched the allegation, stating that it was a fair fight, the case was closed. So we have a mention of the brass knuckles here again. So that was a suspicion put forward by Drysdale to say that it seems likely that it wasn't a metal box, but it was actually brass knuckles that was used. Interestingly, it was a claim that Frank Dukes, the person behind Bloodsport, the alleged true story, where he got in a fight with Zane Frazier when they were looking for fighters for the UFC, which is mentioned on this podcast, obviously. And Dukes would later say that the reason why that fight was one-sided was because he'd been sucker punched with brass knuckles. So it's a common claim, actually, when somebody comes out the wrong side of a street fight. But having said that, again, neither of these reports talk about the other brothers being involved in the incident, despite that being mentioned in the Drysdale and the Josh Simon and other reports as well that we've seen here, including some newspaper reports too.
Regardless of the story behind the matter, this would not be an end to the ground fighting gangster antics. October the same year saw the Gracie brothers involved in yet another assault. This time they attacked a one Manuel Rufino dos Santos. Rufino would go down in history for teaching Euclides Tatu Hatim catch wrestling. Tatu is considered the creator of the Brazilian no-gi submission grappling art of luta livre, which would surpass capoeira in becoming the biggest style rival of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, a feud that would last up until 1991. The reasons behind that feud might be seen in this particular episode. Back in 1931, Rufino was taking his own personal challenge to the Gracies. He'd witnessed Osvaldo, George and Elio apparently win their fights in a Vale Tudo competition in July that year, but hadn't been impressed by the confused rule sets. George, for example, had won his fight via disqualification when his opponent had struck him whilst on the ground, which the Gracies had argued was illegal in that particular match. Again, the facts are a little murky, but Rufino's criticism had either been made in person at the said competition or through press, and he challenged Carlos to a bout. Carlos accepted. True to Rufino's annoyance with the Gracies, there were plenty of debates and negotiations regarding the rule sets, but finally both parties agreed, and the fight took place 1 month later on the 22nd of August. This time, Rufino would win the fight on a technical disqualification. According to the contemporary report cited by Josh Simon, Rufino dominated the first 2 rounds, but the third round was halted when either one or both fighters were in danger of falling out of the ring. However, whereas Rufino paused on the referee's orders, Carlos took advantage of the situation and went in for a choke. The referee halted the action again, ruling Carlos's attack to be a foul. Carlos left the ring in protest. An hour of arguing either resulted in Carlos returning to the ring only to leave again or not return at all. But either way, his protest resulted in the match being awarded to his opponent. An alternative telling of the story appears in the Jiu-Jitsu Legacy website article. In this story, Rufino dominated for the first 2 rounds, forcing Carlos into a defensive position. But in round 3, he would have passed Carlos's guard if the latter hadn't escaped out of the ring, much as his father's wrestler LeConte had done all those years before. When the fight had resumed, Carlos had legitimately snatched Rufino's head into a guillotine, only to release it, claiming his opponent had tapped. Rufino denied he had done so, and the referee agreed, declaring that the fight should continue. Carlos refused, and Rufino was declared the winner. On the humblest of personal anecdotal stories, I have some empathy for Rufino, if in fact he didn't tap, as I had a similar situation in a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu competition. Giving my opponent the benefit of the doubt, I think he might have interpreted my sudden gripping of his hips as a tap. It's water under the bridge, I promise you, and to show no hard feeling, I've since been legitimately tapped countless times by this high percentage technique. In an era and a culture where grandstanding and machismo-fueled contests facilitated individuals' livings, Rufino took full advantage of his victory over the head of the rising grappling dynasty. He spent nearly an entire year telling the press that Carlos was a coward, a clown, and a fraud, decades before Carlos's nephew would leave the UFC when they demanded more restrictive rules and time limits. Rufino would be making the same arguments against the Gracies. A letter published in the newspaper Diário de Notícias, he asked Carlos, quote, "Why, a month after the match, did you request the officials have the fight ruled a no contest? Why didn't you take my student's challenge, Manuel Lima? Why didn't you take catch wrestlers Roberto Rumen's repeated challenges? Why did you want to have a rest period between rounds? Why did you insist on 5-minute rounds instead of 20-minute rounds? Why did you originally want only 3-minute rounds? Why did you not continue to fight? Were you afraid? Why did you challenge other fighters on behalf of your brothers instead of fighting yourself?" End quote. Incidentally, Roberto Rumen appears to be an Argentinian catch wrestler, very successful at the time. He didn't fight Elio or Carlos, but he did fight George and Oswaldo, and it appears that he fought George on 3 different occasions. One of the times was in a Vale Tudo match where George submitted him, apparently choked him to unconsciousness. I don't know what happened in the second bout, but the third bout, the victory appears to have gone to Rumen, where he beat him in by using a pin. The rules were if you could pin someone's back to the mat, you would win. So it wasn't a Vale Tudo competition. It was probably a wrestling style competition, Greco or freestyle. Anyway, apparently Oswaldo took up the challenge against Rumen, but this time it was Rumen who won the fight by a choke. Apparently Oswaldo was choked to unconsciousness, and we have a report here from Coach Babel, a catch wrestling coach. He says that the match culminated in the third round, leaving Mr. Oswaldo Gracie lying unconscious on the floor by hanging. So presumably means a choke. George Gracie immediately went up to resuscitate his brother. And the date for that was on the 16th of July 1939, and it was reported in the Corriere Polistano newspaper. And Coach Babel says, being this the last meeting of the Gracie family with the Argentine fighter and strongman Roberto Rumen. The Gracies decided enough was enough. Rufino was to meet a fate very similar to Baldy's. Within 24 hours of the open letters publication, someone called the Tujuca Tennis Club to ensure Rufino would be there that evening on the 18th of October 1932. The Gracies waited in a car. What followed next diverges into different accounts. According to Josh Simon's article, which may be using information from Drysdale's book, 3 of the brothers ambushed Rufino. This time Elio supposedly inflicted the most amount of damage, and years later it would be he who claimed sole responsibility for the fight. Anyway, Simon states that it was believed that it was Elio who used the previously mentioned metal box to bash the Gracie target over the head, sending him to the ground. Here, Elio's assault was reinforced by Carlos and George with punches and kicks. Oswaldo was apparently waiting in the car. His role as a getaway driver would be employed moments later when the incident drew witnesses out of the tennis club and the Gracies decide to leave the scene. The Jiu-Jitsu Legacy article claims that Rufino was struck repeatedly on the head by the metal box, but its user is not identified. Rufino tried to defend himself, but the brothers immobilized him, allowing Carlos to dislocate his shoulder using an arm lock. In a 1994 interview, Elio Gracie mentioned the incident and framed it as a one-on-one street fight. In this version, Rufino, who's declared as a quote-unquote famous fighter in Brazil, and not by name, said publicly he was going to show the world the Gracies were nothing. Elio name-checks the tennis club as the location of the challenge match. In this story, Rufino threw a punch at Elio, who took him to the ground and left him with, quote, 2 fractures of his head and a broken clavicle and blood spurting out, unquote. Elio then told Playboy, quote unquote, but it was a foolish act I did. It's an interesting, isolated admission of remorse, given that so much of the Gracie reputation was built on fights of this nature. Although Elio would seemingly contradict this in an interview he gave to Kid Pettigrew a few years later for the Gracie Way, where he would explain that as soon as he began training in jiu-jitsu, he stopped getting into street fights. Rufino is not mentioned in the book in any way, but then again, plenty of other characters are conspicuous by their absence, including the instructors between Carlos and Maeda, Ferro and Pires. Maeda is presented as Carlos's sole instructor, a good friend of Gasto Sr., who he knew through political channels. Maeda isn't a judo teacher charged by the Kodokan to assist their representatives in New York, who became a travelling professional wrestler and a circus performer, but an individual employed by Japan to set up a colony in Brazil. Gasto Sr. enables this to happen, and Maeda teaches Carlos Sr. in repayment. Here we get the familiar martial arts story of Japanese being forbidden to teach non-Japanese students, with Carlos being made the exception. However, Maeda has to return to Japan, and Carlos is left to make his own developments of the art, which he teaches to his genius younger brother Elio. Elio, despite his diminutive size, proves his worth by defeating all of Carlos's instructors. Presumably, these weren't their brothers. He's given credit for the main core innovations of the art based on having to compensate for his size, which would become the main selling point of the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu style. This image of a rather small and sickly Elio has also been later challenged by other researchers. Of course, we don't have to look very far into the history of judo to see how the story of a sickly youth, smaller in stature to his rivals, learns a system of martial art and then adapts it to better suit his size and therefore makes it a more efficient all-round system of martial art, and then is able to overcome far larger adversaries. This is the story of Kano Jigoro. It does seem that the Gracies readapted it for their own marketing. Anyway, back to the Gracie Way. Carlos became a shaman and passes the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu business torch to Elio. Since the publication of this book and Elio's death, the story from those supporting the general narrative has changed a little by adding in extra details. For example, Maeda's real work and career are now pretty much a matter of public record, so that has been worked in without a lot of fuss. However, for all the obvious pseudo-history presented, we should stick a pin in the Gracie political connection stated in the Gracie Way. Of course, Elio's Playboy interview does not align with contemporary accounts from newspaper reports collated by later researchers like Drysdale on the 2 websites I've mentioned. Both Jiu-Jitsu Legacy and Simon BJJ confirm the seriousness of Rufino's injuries. Josh Simon states that Rufino had to be hospitalised, and Jiu-Jitsu Legacy says that Rufino required surgery on his shoulder. Both also confirm that Carlos George and Elio were arrested, tried, convicted and sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. According to Josh Simon, the legal defence of the Gracies was a mass of contradictions. The attack was a defence in their honour. They did not perform the attack, and there was no evidence that they did. And if they did attack Rufino, they would not need 3 people to beat him up. Their conviction appeared in the papers on the 24th of May 1934. and 4 days later the brothers reported to the authorities to begin their incarceration. 2 days after that, on the 30th of May, Carlos and Elio officially had their roles terminated from the Polizia Especial. However, it would appear the Gracies really did have pretty strong political connections after all, maybe the same that allowed them to avoid conviction for the Pires and Baldi incidents. According to Simon, the influential feminist poet and private Gracie student Rosalina Coelho Lisboa lobbied for the conviction to be overturned. She and the Gracies were personal friends with the president of Brazil, Getúlio Vargas. This friendship proved extremely helpful as the brothers were granted a presidential pardon, no less. According to Simon, they only spent 10 days in jail. Jiu-Jitsu Legacy cites the Playboy interview where Elio reflected that the pardon demoralized the Supreme Court. He also explained that following the pardon, President Vargas's son would become one of his jiu-jitsu students. A few points worth making here before we return back to the main podcast story. Firstly, the metal box weapon mentioned in at least 2 of these incidents appears to be a misprint of sorts. Jiu-Jitsu Legacy suggests it might have been a metal bar, whereas Josh Simon says that Drysdale thinks it was a knuckle duster. Another interesting point is that Josh Simon does not reference the assault on Pires and only suggests a falling out between Carlos and his teacher as a guess. However, Jiu-Jitsu Legacy doesn't mention the assault on João Baldi. My new research for this revised version of The Way of the Shark comes from articles that mainly cite historical works published in recent years. Closed Guard, The Origins of Jiu-Jitsu is a documentary that Alliance Jiu-Jitsu Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt and retired light heavyweight MMA world champion through Legacy Fight Championship Robert Drysdale announced he was making back in 2018. The film has yet to surface, but his book, Opening Closed Guard, The Origins of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil, the story behind the film, has clearly lit up the BJJ research world and is a big source for the articles I've used. I've yet to read Drysdale's book, but look forward to doing so. It's also worth mentioning the extensive work and sleuthing performed by author Roberto Pereira. His work seems to be less well known and less accessible than Drysdale's work. Pereira has written several historical investigations into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, including his 3-volume Choke, The Untold Story of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Despite only being published in the 2010s, some of these books are quite rare and difficult to buy at a reasonable price, which is a real shame. However, they seem to be amongst the first to reveal contemporary reports of jiu-jitsu in Brazil outside of the country in question, revealing dozens of non-Gracie fighters and promotions that helped shape BJJ. I will now return you back to the original programming. What do we make of that? It's far from uncommon to see trainers and teachers fall out with their protégés and said protégés disowning them. Carlos Gracie and his lineage would be far from the first or last who conveniently cut out middlemen in their training origin stories. Consider arguably the most famous example of Bruce Lee and Ip Man. It would appear that the photographs of the elderly Ip Man with the adolescent little dragon were probably little more than pose pictures for the family album. The main teaching of the school's beginners and intermediates during Lee's relatively brief stint, where he learned the first 2 empty hand forms and a portion of the wooden dummy form, was handed to Wang Shunliang, the king of talking hands. Liang was certainly a well-respected fighter at the time and one of the school's top students, but he would never be able to compete with his head teacher's legendary status. Ip Man was an individual who did plenty in his own lifetime to lionize his own legend and mythologize Wing Chun. At this point, it is worth noting that the terms Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu are often used interchangeably. It is true they're pretty much the same martial art, and at the time of UFC 1, they were one and the same. Only in the past decade, due to schisms within the Gracie family, has a clear distinction been made. Those promoting Elio Gracie's line continue to push the argument that their art is primarily for self-defense, which they see as being represented in Vale Tudo-style fights, the model for the early UFC, and use the brand Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Others, such as Carlos Gracie Jr., son of his namesake, the art's founder, are happy to call their sport Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. According to the Gracie Way book by Kid Pellegro, Horian insisted on calling the art Gracie Jiu-Jitsu when he was promoting in North America, and it's clearly the label used in the first UFC. However, whilst we're here, and given what we know about the history of Jiu-Jitsu and Judo in Brazil, the world outside of Brazil now knows of non-Gracie lineage BJJ. For example, Omori Gio was also a Kodokan black belt who taught in Brazil around the same time as Maeda. He apparently had students in Rio in the mid to late 1920s and started Sao Paulo's first jiu-jitsu school in 1931, several years before Pires and George Gracie. He was part of the Vale Tudo scene, defeating boxers, capoeiristas and wrestlers in documented fights. Unsurprisingly, he also had a feud with the Gracies and drew in matches against Carlos and Elio, and eventually lost to George after 10 rounds. After his death in 1938, Omori would be considered a mere footnote in the Gracie legend if it wasn't for the fact that a famous other non-Gracie BJJ teacher, Luis Franca, claimed lineage to him, and Franca's own student, Oswaldo Fada, had his own inter-club feud with the Gracies in the 1950s. Fada, who famously taught to Rio's poor when the Gracies taught to the city's middle classes, employed a lot of footlocks, which caught their opponents off guard, possibly winning the first team challenge overall, and definitively winning the rematch against the Gracies. The competitive teams Nova União and grappling fight team Dio Jiu-Jitsu and Equipe Mestre Milson Jiu-Jitsu all claim lineage to Franca and Fada. However, Franca's lineage has its own problems. Throughout his research, Robert Drysdale found nothing to link Franca to Omori Gio. Franca also claimed initial lineage to both Sataki Soshirio and Maeda Misio, of which Drysdale again says there is zero evidence. He suspects, just as Josh Simon has suspected of Mario Alexio, that Franca was self-taught. Nevertheless, it is quite evident that not all jiu-jitsu in Brazil today can be traced back to Carlos Gracie, or even Maeda. This concludes the second part of The Way of the Shark. Stick around after these messages for information on the next part of the story. Thanks for listening to the show. If you're so inclined, there are many ways you can express your support and help keep this podcast going. For example, I've published several books on Amazon. If you'd like a signed copy of any of them, please drop me an email. You can also purchase my online Vagabond Warriors martial arts cross-training courses and the online Animal Instincts Children's Self-Protection Teaching Program. More direct support can be shown through Buy Me a Coffee and my Patreon page. I'm most grateful to all those who have already bought my books and courses and those who continue to kindly donate to the show. As for my services, the heart of all that is CCMA, nowadays I teach private lessons, courses and seminars. These are bespoke services that put you in charge of your martial arts journey. I teach self-protection and martial arts cross-training. You can train with me, one-to-one, or in a small group. I count individual clients, couple clients, parent and child clients, and various other combinations. These can be taught face-to-face or virtually. I also regularly teach clubs, societies and associations nationally and internationally. Please go to clubchimera.com for more details. Please don't forget to subscribe to the show on whatever podcast platform you are currently using. If you could leave me a 5-star rating and a review, I would be most grateful. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, X and TikTok. Facebook also has a members group in addition to the main business page, so please send in a request to join in with the training discussions and be a part of the wider CCMA community. I'm also uploading new content to YouTube. There are various shorts, vlogs and full video versions of some of these podcast episodes on there. Again, please subscribe, like, share and leave a comment. All favourable engagement helps keep CCMA moving forward. In The Way of the Shark Part 3, we push the historical timeline back to the 1990s, looking at both the supposed substantiated claim that the majority of real fights end up on the ground, and also the allegations made against the Gracies and their involvement in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. That's all in the next episode.